Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of Qualia. In this episode of Qualia, we thought of stepping outside our comfort zone and we thought of trying something new. As of this episode, we can be completely honest with you that we both don't have the slightest clue of what we are going to talk about. We both are going to talk about one thing which has inspired us this week. This time, we try our hands on improv podcasting. Hope you enjoy.
Okay, Pradeep. Before we actually move into this new thing that we are doing, I just want to clarify a couple of things here. Last week, I was watching this web series on YouTube by the TVF channel. It is known as Aspirants. It talks about the struggle and life of UPSC aspirants. In that, a character tells a story about a ceramics professor in the United States. What the ceramics professor does is he divides his students into two groups, and one group he asks to make the perfect pot. He asks them to just focus on making that one perfect. And to second group of students, what he tells is he asks them to make as many pots as possible. At the end of 30 days, what he witnesses is that the first group had beautiful pots. It had like 10 or 15 pots that were absolutely beautiful. But the second group had an even larger number of great pots. It was like the second group, by the very act of iteration, the very thing that we do in computer programming using loops like for and while, they iterated continuously and actually were able to make the most number of perfect. Why is this story relevant now? This story is relevant because I wanted to clarify to our listeners that today we are hell-bent on trying new things like these that we are going to try today. Our hope from this episode onwards is to try and do as many as new things and new podcasts and new content for the listeners so that we would be able to iterate ourselves and give you the best podcast out there. So yeah, that's something I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, before that, I'd like to ask you, why this one more thing? How did you come up with this concept of one more thing? Was it inspired from any other podcast, or how did you come up with this, Rohan?
Okay, this might be strange, but this one more thing is a phrase used by the company Apple. And in their presentation, when they release new iPhones, they have this section called one more thing, where at the end of the presentation, they drop this huge heading of one more thing and they exclusively release a product. It's a surprise to the consumers. So I thought by doing this one more thing, will not only be surprising ourselves, we'll also be surprising our listeners by the different kind and variety of knowledge that we will eventually bring on to the table. I thought it would just be interesting. That's my philosophy about it.
And moreover, I'd like you to start with your first one more thing here because I'm preparing on the go on my topic. So I'd like you to go first.
Okay. Over the past week, what I have been doing is I have been reading this book, Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And this book is a very heavy book. It's like 700 pages and it has 500 pages of non-fiction content with 200 pages of references. So it's a heavy book. So I'll not be able to tell what the book tells you, but a particular essence which actually caught my mind is about the capitalism that our society is undergoing. So what happens is there is this concept in sociology of modernity. See, modernity is something which talks about the development of an individual. It talks about the urbanization. It talks about the capitalism, and it also talks about the belief in possibilities of technological and political progress. It's a sociological concept, and it's used to tell why humans do certain things the way they do. So this concept of modernity, it's actually divided into two: first modernity and second modernity. If you see people born before the 19th century, at least in America, they had to live a life that was already dictated for them. They had to grow up in the same house, do the same job, and live the same life that all the people in their village lived. But with industrialization, people now had the opportunity to move out and make an identity of their own. With improvements in material conditions, people actually now had the opportunity to dictate their own lives. They were the authors of their own book. It all started as the agriculture society gave its way to industrial society. This is what we call as the first modernity. In this, I would like to also talk about the form of capitalism. If you see in the first modernity, there was this famous capitalist, Henry Ford, who wanted every person in America to own a car. He made this possible by inventing most of what we call today the mass production. His idea was to use the free individual as both as a worker and also as a consumer. He wanted to introduce this free individual as an assembly line worker to make a car that this assembly line worker would eventually buy. So this was capitalism in its purest form. Ford did something that soon became the standard everyone operated to. With this rapid modernization, we also had this double movement where there were a network of powerful institutions which were designed to check the actions of the market relative to land, labor, and money. So now you have this capitalist industries and also you have this powerful agencies, usually government ones, which actually saw through that these capitalist industries were not exploiting and were performing as they were meant to do. This is something defined as double movement. Now we come to the second modernity. Second modernity is actually the transition between this industrial society to the knowledge information society. I know it's a great time to be alive. We are all part of this information society, but I want to stress out that it's also time of surveillance capitalism. It's the birth of new form of capitalism that we haven't seen before. It's the form of capitalism that companies like Google and Facebook. And here I want to also talk about the history of the company Google, because Google is like Ford, who started the capitalization in the first modernity. We have Google, which is starting this surveillance capitalism in the second modernity. So Google was started by two Stanford grad students from their dorm rooms. This company was well funded throughout the initial years in the late 90s. So their only motto when they were born was that to provide the best search engine experience to their users. These founders actually hated the idea of advertising. Only when the dot-com bubble burst, the company's investors forced it to look for revenue options. At that time, a Google employee, Amit Patel, he had all these logs and information about the users. He had every search query as a log into company database. So what they did was, when they started to analyze this data, they were able to tell so much about a single user that as a company, Google seemed to have broken the holy grail of advertising. And I think it's episode 5 where we also talk about advertisements. I would like to ask the listeners to go through that episode also. So the holy grail of advertising is the idea of being able to deliver a particular message to a particular person at the moment when it might have high probability of actually influencing his or her behavior. So this is something mind-boggling. As soon as Google introduced this advertising model into the system, its revenues reached to 3.2 billion US dollars. It's actually a 3,600% revenue increase in just 4 years. That's something unimaginable. Today, for these companies, especially like Google and Facebook, the consumers are not actually users. They exist for advertisers who want to use their behavioral data surplus these companies have about their users. So to be clear, we are not the actual users of Google and Facebook. The Google and Facebook of today exist because of the advertisers. They exist for the advertisers. They are just using their users like us as a means to an end. And there is also this vast informational asymmetry where these companies, in a way, know everything about us and we hardly know anything about them. I'm sure soon, with advances in computational techniques, I feel their only goal will be to automate us. I feel we need some sort of double movement As in the case of first modernity, I strongly feel that we also need a double movement in case of the second modernity with companies like Google and Facebook to overcome the threats posed by these surveillance capitalist firms. Every user action today is considered a signal which is to be analyzed and then fed back to system so as to provide information to the advertisers. I think these companies soon would make privacy an obsolete thing that humans used to enjoy in the past. I think it's something that we ought to have noticed, but we never actually did. The great thing about our species is our ability to have overcome so many things that usually seem to destroy our species once and for all. But we have overcome all those things, and I'm hopeful we'll overcome this also. But the interesting part would always be to figure out how. So, yeah, that's my one more thing for this week. So, Pradeep, any comments, anything that you have? I know it's a long, boring monologue, but I just felt so much interesting about this topic that I thought I had to talk about.
Oh, as you said, that took you some time to finish that. And I see that there's been a lot of research into what you're talking about, man. So it's really informative. Yeah. And how did you stumble upon this book?
This book is an actually McKinsey Business Book Award winner of the year, I think 2020 or 2009. So I thought I should give it a read. I didn't know anything about this book, but as soon as I started, it was about Google and Apple and Facebook, and it just got me. And what's your take on one more thing for this week? I'm very interested to know because I know you always bring great things to the table.
Well, thank you, Rohan, for your compliment. And I'm going to narrate something that everyone understands and something that everyone knows about this. But still, of all the years that we've lived and of all the days, we've never stopped to spare thought about this. And if you are someone who stops to spare thought about things like this, hats off to you. So I'd like to start with this. You know, Rohan, I've been recently studying Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche. You know that I am into philosophy, and now that I've started reading this hardcore philosophy, Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil is one of his very famous works. And in this work, he dedicates an entire chapter to criticizing philosophers who lived in a time prior to Nietzsche. So he doesn't just criticize the philosophers, he criticizes them for the way that their psyche worked and the prejudice that they adopted towards building philosophy. I want to talk about this very famous aphorism 19 from Beyond Good and Evil. In this, Nietzsche talks about free will. And to anyone who doesn't know what free will is the exact opposite thing of science until Newton. Everyone thought that everything in the world couldn't be determined. Everyone knew that chaos was the only thing which unfolded, and they knew of it in different forms. But then Newton Newton made calculus. He said that you can predict where a body can be, a heavenly body or an earthly body for that matter, and you can predict where it can be. And this brought in a whole new structure of Newtonian determinism, where it said that with the right parameters and with the right hypothesis in hand, we can predict almost everything in the world. And to this day, very famous atheists of our time, Sam Harris, Dr. Richard Dawkins, all of them, they all believe in determinism. They say that something like free will doesn't exist. And if you see mythologies and if you see religion, free will has a fairly large share of its own contribution to art and mythology and religion. So here, Nietzsche talks about free will. And to give a further example, we spoke about free will a lot in our last episode of Crime and Punishment, where we were talking about if Raskolnikov really did those murders out of his free will or not. So Nietzsche says that the free will concept has been assumed by philosophers to be a given. He says that the philosophers have a prejudice in their mind according to which they think that free will is just there. They don't think that the free will can be reducted or it can be added. The free will is just there. It is a very, very independent variable, and every being that has life possesses free will. At least until Schopenhauer, they had this understanding of free will. Now, what does Nietzsche say? Nietzsche says that To get out of the prejudice of philosophers, this time let us step down and let us be unphilosophical and let us think. If you will to do an action, what are the sensations that are associated with it? Like, for example, you want to make a cup of coffee for yourself. What are the sensations that you have to overcome or that you have to endure to make that cup of coffee? So, what Nietzsche says goes like this. He says that there is a plurality of sensations. And to break it down in normal English, he says that there is multiple sensations associated with this. The sensation one is away from which we go. For example, where do you go away from? You're going away from a state of tiredness and you want to get away from this state. So you think about making a cup of coffee. And the second sensation is towards which we go. Now, I want to go towards having a brisk morning. So I want to go make a cup of coffee. So these two sensations are now in hand. The sensation of away from which we go and the sensation of towards which we go. And thirdly, there is a sensation associated with the movement of your muscles and your physical ability. Like as soon as you have this thought, you wake up, you get up from your bed, you go and you make coffee. This sensation of muscles. And this is most of the time when we will to do stuff, mostly when we will to protect ourselves from an impending danger or something, this free will acts upon itself and our body just reacts without us even thinking. So thirdly, there is a thought which is associated to this. Thought of, I should get up and make a coffee. And why should I make that? I should make that coffee because I want to kickstart my morning briskly and not sluggishly. So every will, every action has a thought underlying it. If we were to remove this thought, the will and the action, it just doesn't exist. Now, of all last, and when I read this, it took me like 5, 6 reads throughout the entire aphorism to understand it. But once I understood it, I was mind blown. And let me tell you, this is the most interesting part. Now we have crossed the plurality of sensations, the sensations of away from which we go, towards which we go, and the sensation of physical ability. And then we came across thought, and now we are stepping into emotion. That thought you get, that thought won't be there if not for emotions. Now, what does Nietzsche say is, what role does emotion has to play with free will? Nietzsche says that you are made up of micro entities, and he would like to call these micro entities undersouls. You have these undersouls within you, and these micro entities, they are in a constant battle for power. Like, for example, part of you says that, okay, get up, go make coffee. And part of you says that, nah, it's okay, I'll just lie in bed. What happens is these micro personalities, which arise as a consequence of your emotions, what these micro personalities do is one wants to go one way and other wants to go another way. And there will be another emotion right there which wants you to make you check your phone in the morning rather than making coffee or lying in bed. It just wants you to get up and check your email or something. And tertiarily, what Nietzsche brings us here is he says that all these micro entities, they are constantly in a battle for power. At the same time, let's assume that you get up and you go and make that cup of coffee. Now, that micro entity which wanted you to go and make a cup of coffee has won over all the other entities which wanted you to do different things. So at the same time, all these entities, they have not been able to do what they wanted to, and they've surrendered to the tyranny of that emotion which won. So now we have a social hierarchy here where the one emotion, the one micro entity which made you get up and go make coffee, that entity is over the top. That is the commander. And all the other entities, these entities, knowingly or unknowingly, willingly or unwillingly, they worked with your body and the sensation and thought and emotion of that micro entity, and they all surrendered to it. How Nietzsche makes this distinction is he calls that entity which wins as the commanding entity. And the other entities, they are the undersouls. They are the ones whose intentions have been compromised. Nietzsche brings this example to something like a commonwealth, You see, in every commonwealth, there is a governing body, and that governing body is governing over the riches for which other people worked for. So, this hierarchy, which we see often in the society, like you have this in corporate offices, you have this in government offices, you have this in governments running countries and states, there's this hierarchy. He says that there is an intrinsic hierarchy which is inherent to will and the being. This hierarchy has its own commanders and its own soldiers. And even though they don't work in synchronization, we never really realize it. And moreover, you can ask me, like, isn't this some kind of prejudice or isn't this some kind of assumption? But moreover, I don't think it's not in my place to reflect upon that. I think that something like this, some 2 pages written by Nietzsche, I think that this requires for a normal human being like me to spare almost like 2 years of thought on it. Only then I can make some minimalistic sense out of it. So rather than getting into the devil in the details, I love how Nietzsche brought upon this whole concept of social hierarchy and social structure within us, within every being, that they have a social structure where they are the ones who command and they are the ones who obey. And this social structure manifests out of life like anything else. And we have different names for it. The names might be misleading, the names might be well, because only one part, one micro entity in your body wills to do that. All the other micro entities does not will to do that, but we call it will. Nietzsche also says that most of the toughest philosophical problems, they come down to problems in our language. So I was really awestruck by this definition of free will and this exhibit of free will by Nietzsche. And I would totally recommend this book for people who are getting to know some good philosophy. After all, philosophy, I believe, is one of the things that gives most pleasure in life. So I would totally recommend you guys Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. That's it, Ron.
If my memory serves right, I was Nietzsche who had this quote which goes like, quote, and those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who couldn't hear the music. End quote. Once you read this quote, I don't think you can stop thinking how incredible Nietzsche's book. I'm sure I would try my hands on Nietzsche.
Since you talk about the quotes of Nietzsche, I also wanted to tell this quote where there is an arrogant display of Nietzsche's arrogance. He says that what I can write in one line takes some people a book to write. He says this, and then there is a pause, and he says, well, maybe not even a book. He makes the most arrogant statement and he tops it himself. Nietzsche is like the top lobster of philosophers who normal people can understand. And I really love reading this book. And as of as of you, Rohan, I think you are the one who's representing the listeners here. So if you want to make some, if you want to make any cross examinations or if you want some detail on anything of which I spoke about, you can ask me.
The way you brought in the example of coffee, the very act of making a coffee and the various thoughts that you have while making that coffee, it was very great. And yeah, I think you just can't understand after you hear it once. I think it's something deep, and yeah, I have no questions for you, bro. The way you did was great.
So yes, Rohan, how do you think the first one more thing went?
Yeah, I think it was a success. I think I would definitely like to do it again. I
Surely.
really enjoyed it because you see what happens in a regular podcast is we think of this frame, get into this box that we are going to do this, we are going to talk about this. It's all very fixed and it doesn't help our brains and thoughts to mingle with each other and bring out something that's a product of who we are. I'm sure there can be hundreds of philosophers and capitalist experts who can be talking about capitalism and philosophy better than we do. But it's just that nobody can talk like me or nobody can talk Nietzsche like you do, Pradeep. So I think this really helps us to bring out what we actually think and what our thoughts are. It actually helps us to bring something new, something of a newer perspective, so that I feel the listeners will really enjoy. And also, to all the listeners, if you have any questions or if you have any reviews and recommendations, I'm sure you could always mail us at pod.qualia@gmail.com, where regularly have a chat with interesting listeners. Yeah. What do you think, Pradeep? How has this been for you?
Actually, what you said, Rohan, I think we have done justice to the title of our podcast. We are doing qualia, and qualia is subjective experience that is very unique for every being. And I believe that we have to continuously put in effort to tell our perspective and our thoughts on globally big things. And I'm quite happy doing this, man. So yeah, I think we've established a good base of listeners too. And I'd like to let our listeners know that now we have listeners from more than 25 countries, and we are touching almost like 500 plays. So I'd really like to thank you guys for supporting us constantly through this and through our period of metamorphosis. That's it for this episode of Qualia. We would love to hear on what you think about our show. You could always mail us your thoughts and comments at pod.qualia@gmail.com, or you could follow us at qualia_pod on Instagram. Stay tuned and see you guys until the next one.